We're with Jeff Benedict right now. The book is Dynasty. Jeff, I have looked at this book, but I'm going to be honest, and I hate to admit this because normally I will read something in its entirety before I have the author on, but this book is 600 pages. Jeff, you're not doing us any favors with the length of this book, but I did read your book that you did with Armin Katayan about Tiger Woods. I enjoyed it so much so that I passed it on to my dad and my brother. And I think there are probably, I was just actually on Amazon before you came on looking at how many books there are right now about the Patriots. And there are, by my count, about 28 different books about this current Patriot dynasty, starting with Patriot Reign, Michael Hawley, way back when they first won in 2001. But this book could go down as the holy grail for everything about this dynasty. And it's fascinating to read about these three people, Robert Kraft, Bob Kraft, of course, Bill Belichick, and now Bucs quarterback Tom Brady. So in just the beginning of the book, I noticed the angle that you're taking is from, it looks like you went at Bob Kraft first. So kind of take us through that. How did you get into maybe the most secretive franchise in sports history?
Well, first of all, I'll say I read all those books you referred to. Just like with Tiger Woods, there were more books than that about Tiger before we did his biography. And one of the jobs of a biographer is to read every book and try to read everything that's been written before in order to do a more definitive and complete book like The Dynasty. In this case, I decided to go to Robert Kraft first, simply because there are two reasons. One, he owns the team. I mean, this is his organization, and right. He's been there longer than Brady or Belichick. He built it from the ground up. And so I thought it was best to try to go in through the front door. I had no relationship with Kraft, Brady, or Belichick, but I started with Kraft because he's the owner. I introduced myself to him in a letter. I wrote him the old-fashioned way and told him what I wanted to do, which was essentially write the definitive history of the team. And I wanted to try to answer two central questions. How was this dynasty built? And then how was it sustained for so long? And I wanted Kraft, Belichick, and Brady to be the three main figures in the story because I think they're the three main cogs in this machine. And but starting with Kraft to me seemed like the natural choice just because it's his organization, and I needed to gain his trust and build a rapport there that would enable me to be able to be inside the organization. And
he replied to your letter? It was that, I guess, simple, so to speak?
I mean, he did reply to my letter, and he replied via writing his own letter, which was, to me, a signal of how unique and different he is. I didn't know him at that point. I was just making a judgment based on the fact that I thought it was unusual for someone in his position to be writing a letter to someone like me, a journalist whom he didn't know. He certainly knows plenty of journalists, but he didn't know me.
Right.
And that was the beginning of what was a long dialogue that started through writing and then went to face-to-face meetings and eventually evolved to me starting to spend time with other people in the organization.
Do you get the sense, and I know that your reporting was extensive, you interviewed people that I don't think have ever done an interview before. Do you get the sense that Robert Kraft, and particularly Bill Belichick, and I think Tom Brady to an extent, did you get the sense in your reporting that these guys at some point recognized the last 20 years is historic, not just in football history, but in sports history, that this needs to be chronicled and documented somehow?
I think all three of them, in their own way, realized that. I mean, it was clear to me that Kraft realized and appreciated that. I think that he's at a point in his life where he's had a lot to look back on and appreciate the significance of what's been accomplished there. In Brady's case, there was a great moment when I was interviewing Tom. The interviews I did with Tom took place in his suite at Gillette Stadium. Mm-hmm. He's the only player, obviously, that has a suite for his family to watch the games on Sunday.
Oh, like a luxury box.
A luxury box.
Okay.
And so our interviews were done in that box. And in one of the times we were in that box, we were always alone, of course. There was no one else in there. And one of the times we were there, he was looking out at the empty stadium. In fact, that is a scene in chapter 1 where there's a moment where he's alone looking out at an empty Gillette Stadium. It's right before the start of the 2019 season, which will be his last in New England. And he's looking out and he says out loud, how did all of this happen? And I think that question, it's a great question. And from a journalist standpoint, to be sitting there and listening to him saying that out loud, as you look out at this stadium that really he made history in for 20 years. He was one of 3 central players who did things that have never been done before in the NFL and will probably never be done again. And I think Tom has an appreciation for that.
What kind of guy is Tom Brady? And you know, I've tried to get him to do a one-on-one, and I'm originally from New England, and I've played that card. I wrote him a handwritten note, dropped it off at his house. I've done every kind of unorthodox thing, you know, including going through the proper channels. What kind of guy is Tom Brady? There's got to be something about him that sets him apart besides, you know, he's got a good arm.
Yeah, I mean, going into the interviews with him, the one thing I knew was that he was the greatest quarterback who's ever played the game. Everybody knows that. What I didn't know was what kind of man is he? And being alone with him in those interviews that I did, what really shined through for me was the kind of son he is to his parents, the kind of husband he is to Giselle, the kind of father he is to his children, and the kind of friend he is to a lot of people, the people that are closest to him. An anecdote that might signal to you the kind of guy he is. I was a stranger to him before we started doing these interviews. And in one of the interviews, he could tell I had hurt my back badly. And it was hard for me to sit down for this particular interview because it was uncomfortable for me. He asked me what was wrong, and I told him. He immediately kind of started diagnosing my problem. And then he immediately said, you know, you need to see Alex. And obviously Alex Guerrero is the guy who has had a huge impact on Brady playing this long. And he just pulled out his phone and reached out to Alex, texted him right there and said, you know, he introduced me to Alex. And the next day I was in Alex's clinic across the street from the stadium getting worked on.
Yeah.
I mean, he didn't have to do that. I mean, it's
right.
These are little things that he's notorious for. It's the kind of guy who remembers to say thank you to the janitor or the security guards that work at the stadium. He notices people who do the little things, and they're the people that are the easiest to overlook when you're on the top of the pedestal.
Says Tom's a lot about character, yeah.
Yeah, it says just a lot about the kind of guy he is, which for me was really a pleasure to interview for a book like this.
Tom Brady's somebody that will be involved with TB12, you know, post-career, whenever that is, whenever he hangs him up. What do you see him doing besides that? Do you see politics in his future? What could you see Brady doing, or did he tell you anything that he has planned? Because he'll be a young man still.
Yeah, this would be conjecture on my part. So, because these are not the kind of questions I asked.
Right.
I wasn't really interested in his future when writing a book about the Dynasty, so I didn't ask those questions. I will just say that I think early on in his career, there's actually an incredible scene in this book where he gets a phone call. Well, Robert Kraft gets a phone call from President Bush, and this is Bush Jr., who's president at the time. He wants Brady to come down for the State of the Union address. This is in 05 or 04. And Brady gets on a plane, the Patriots private plane with Jonathan Kraft, and goes down and sits in the First Lady's box with other women from the Bush cabinet. And at that time, there were things being published nationally about Brady's future as a politician. He could be the senator from the state of Massachusetts. He could run for president someday. That was a long time ago. A lot has happened since then. I don't know how really interested Tom would be in doing that. I know he turned down Donald Trump's invitation for him to speak at the Republican National Convention in 2016. I think that Tom is, in some ways, he's too good and too nice of a guy, maybe for politics. But I think he's got a great head for business. And Yeah, I expect that he'll do really well business-wise. I think he has a lot to offer. The point is, he could do just about anything he wants to because of how driven he is and because of the kind of personality he has.
You interviewed, as I said earlier, I mean, the amount of people that you've interviewed. Tell me about what did Lee Johnson, and this is a name that I had to look back up, and I'm a Patriots fan first. He was a punter for the team, tail end of his career, but you interviewed a lot of obscure people to try and get a better picture for what people like Bill Belichick, Robert Kraft, and Tom Brady are like. But what did Lee Johnson have to say about Brady?
So Lee Johnson was one of the greatest punters who's ever played in the NFL, top 2 or 3 for sure. And he went to New England right around the time Belichick became the head coach. He ended up being Tom Brady's locker mate. That's one of the reasons I was so interested in interviewing him, was because for Tom Brady's first 2 seasons in New England, Lee Johnson and he shared lockers. They were right side by side. And Lee had these great conversations with Tom when Tom was a rookie. And going back to your previous question, what kind of guy is Tom Brady? What Lee Johnson told me was how stunning it was to have a kid who literally was a kid right out of Michigan,
Right.
who was asking him questions in the locker room about what's it like to be a father with 5 children in the NFL? How do you balance the relationship with your wife and your kids and the commitment that's needed to play this game and all the travel and the moving around? And Lee said to me, at that point, he'd been in the league for, I think, 15 years. He said he'd never had anybody ask him those kinds of questions, never mind someone who was a rookie. It said a lot to him about the kind of guy that Tom was at that time. The other thing Lee was really helpful with was Lee was one of the first players that Bill Belichick, for lack of a better term, fired. I mean, you don't really fire players in the NFL. You cut them or you trade them. But Johnson got cut because he flubbed a punt. I mean, here's one of the most decorated punters of all time. He messed up a punt. He fumbled it. The other team scored as a result. And the next morning, he got called into Bill's office and he got told, "We're letting you go." Yeah. And it was, for me, it was a great insight because Lee took me in Bill's office and really walked me through blow by blow what that conversation was like and enabled me to recreate it in the book.
What did he say? How was Bill with that situation?
He basically looked, the way it works is Bill's assistant comes to the player and says, "Coach wants to see you in his office now."
Right.
And you kind of know that's not a good thing. And he said, I walked in there and sat down and Bill just looked at him and said, "You're slipping. We're going to let you go."
And this has been the key. I mean, so Ty Law, Laura Malloy, Richard Seymour, Rodney Harrison, you go right on through.
Yes.
Honestly, Randy Moss, right up until Tom Brady. And there's this narrative that's been cast, especially now with Tom down here in Tampa, and they're 3-2. They're tied for first in the division. They're having, he's having a lot of success here. But he's 43 years old. He's probably not the Brady that he was. He did say that he kind of has the answers to the test now because he knows these defenses. There's nothing that they're going to show him that he hasn't seen before. But there's this narrative that's been cast that Brady and Belichick kind of hated each other, almost like, it took a while for Walsh and Montana to come back together. Actually, Walsh was in really poor health by the time they finally, reunited. I kind of disagree with that. I think that, Brady kind of wanted to go and Belichick, maybe he would have kept him on for a little bit. But what did you find when you were sort of learning about the dynamic between these two? Because it's not like this is not the Yankees of the 50s and 60s. This is 20 years.
It is
different. It's 20 years.
It's totally different. And so much of the book is about the relationship between the 3 key men. So here are the relationships. There's the Kraft Brady relationship, which is very familial. It is genuinely like a father-son relationship. Then there's the Kraft Belichick relationship, which is they're both older than Tom and they see the world a little differently. And it's Kraft and Belichick don't have the closeness that Kraft has with Brady, but they have great honesty between them and trust. And it's the most efficient owner-coach relationship in all of sports. And then there's the Brady-Belichick relationship. And that's the relationship that I liken to Paul McCartney and John Lennon in the book.
Right. I saw that comparison. Yeah, the Beatles, right?
And I compare them that for this simple reason that, when John and Paul started, they had a very different relationship than when they ended. When they started, it was fun. And it was, they were just becoming the Beatles. And it's sort of like that with Tom and Bill. I mean, you think about it, in Tom's first year as a starter, they win the Super Bowl. I mean, who
Right.
does that?
Right.
And he goes to
Jeff,
Disneyland
let me just ask you, did you interview Drew Bledsoe for this book?
a lot.
Okay, I'll be curious to hear about that. Okay.
I did. And, I think that moment after the first Super Bowl with the Rams, when Belichick and Brady end up in a taxi cab or a limo right outside their hotel, it's the following morning. They have barely slept.
Right.
They're on top of the world. And
Well,
Brady's getting ready to go to Disneyland. And Belichick's telling him, you had a pretty good season, but he's warning him, things are going to change now. I mean, you've won a Super Bowl in your early 20s. The world is going to change for you. And he's kind of giving him some warnings. And over the next, say, 5 years, when they win 2 more Super Bowls, that's when things really do change. And I think their relationship becomes much more professional and businesslike. And because it goes for so long, 20 years is an eternity in the National Football League.
yeah.
It's an eternity in baseball, to be honest with you.
It's an eternity if you work at State Farm. I mean, it doesn't matter
Yes.
what you do,
That's right. And I think what Kraft's genius is, to me, this is the secret sauce of the dynasty, is Robert Kraft is the ultimate diplomat. And that's showed through in this book when you see the way that he works those relationships. He's the key to keeping Tom Brady in New England for 20 years. Belichick is not the key. Kraft is the key. And I think they get to the point where the two of them recognize that, look, Tom knows that Bill's the greatest coach of all time. He knows that. And Bill knows that Tom Brady is the best player he's ever coached.
Right.
He may not say that much, but he knows what they did together.
He'll say it at some point.
He will. And I think
10
that
years
that's the key. And to me, when they walked off the stage in Atlanta after winning their 6th Lombardi trophy together, that's why at the end of the book, I liken that to John and Paul walking out of the studio, Abbey Road, after making that last great Beatles album. They weren't friends anymore. They weren't close that way, but they could still make the best music in the world. And that's the way it was for Brady and Belichick.
You go through something I'd never really thought about in the book. You talk kind of about quarterback actuary tables. I think it's maybe 2010, which to me seems, I mean, it's a decade ago, it's 10 years ago, but there was a chance that, I mean, they were going to re-sign Brady, but Brady was as far as quarterbacks go, he was on the back 9. And so I had to look it up. You look at Elway, Marino, Montana, Young, the greats of the 80s, 90s, and some of the greats of all time, all out of the game by 37, 38 years old.
Yes.
So you're looking at these quarterback actuary tables. Take us back to 2010. What was going on then?
So at that point, Brady had been in the league for 10 years. And more importantly, he had sustained a serious knee injury at the start of the 08 season, which forced him to miss the entire season. He came back in 09 and had a good season. But going into 2010, his contract was up. And the question was, how much longer is he going to be able to play at an elite level? Because there's 2 actuary charts. There's one that looks at just sort of length of quarterback, and he was already starting to get up there on that. But then there's another chart that deals with players, quarterbacks who suffer knee injuries. And the medical wisdom was that 2 to 3 years tops coming back from a knee injury like that before you're done. And so the Patriots had all that data. Belichick had that data. And the Patriots doctors were basically saying, look, yes, we've looked at him and he had a great season in 09 and his knee is healthy, but, and this was a huge but, look at the numbers, look at his age. It would have been one thing if he had this knee injury when he was 24, but he's not 24. I mean, this guy's going into that time where quarterbacks pack it in. And so there is a summit in Cape Cod that takes place between Robert Kraft, Tom Brady, and Jonathan Kraft. And basically, it's not in writing. They don't make a contract, but they make a gentleman's agreement. It's all oral. And there's an understanding that Kraft is basically going to protect Brady. And when I say protect him, what I mean is he believes in Tom. He wants Tom to be the starter for as long as Tom can play. And he actually believes that Tom can play a lot longer because he trusts Tom.
Right.
But he's telling him basically, look, we all know what Belichick's history is with moving on from players when they get into the sunset years of their career. And he's basically telling Tom, if that starts to happen here, I'll give you the ability to leave, to get traded, or to go to another team. It gives Tom the important assurance that he needs, that he's not going to end up riding the bench in New England, or sort of getting jettisoned in a way that would, hurt him. And that's important. And over the next 10 years, this is played out over and over again, where Brady and Kraft's relationship keeps Tom for another 2 years or another 3 years. And of course, we know what happens to Tom. He defies all the actuary charts, both for age and for a knee injury. He's started every game. I mean, that's the thing. In the second half of this run, he took the team to 5 more Super Bowls and won 3 of them.
Yeah, it's changing. It's changing everything. It's changing all the rules.
Yeah.
Do you think that Tom Brady, when he talks about, no, I want to keep playing, and for me, it's not about the numbers and the stats. That's what he says publicly. But then you see a great friend of his is Peyton Manning, and he sent an email to a friend talking about Manning, basically intimating that, I'll eventually beat all Manning's records once Manning retires. Come to find out that it's exactly what's happened. Manning's neck, abandoned him, and Manning had to retire, and Brady has passed every Manning number there is. Is it for the cameras, or is that really genuine did you find Tom Brady to be genuine in that sense? Because my thought was, a year ago, I was like, no way Brady leaves the Patriots, because he knows he's aware of legacy as well. Before I came to Tampa here and became a reporter down here, I was in Kansas City, and prior to Mahomes and Kelsey, you'd go to Arrowhead and all you'd see is Joe Montana jerseys. And I was like, Joe Montana was here for a year and a half. Granted, he took you to the playoffs, and he, he was good for a couple of years, but Joe Montana is a 49er.
Yes.
He's not a member of the Chiefs. So
Right.
Let's say Tom Brady wins the Super Bowl this year here in Tampa, and I'm all for that happening. Tom Brady's a Patriot.
Yeah. I think there's another great scene, and this is toward the very end of the book. It's the season that they go to beat the Rams in the Super Bowl, and they unexpectedly, as you know, knock off Mahomes and the Chiefs at Arrowhead that year in the AFC Championship game. Right before the start of that game, Robert Kraft was in the tunnel at Arrowhead Stadium, and he bumped into Joe Montana and his wife, and they exchanged greetings, and then Montana walked out onto the field to great applause from the stadium. And Kraft was left standing there in the tunnel looking out at that and thinking to himself, this isn't right. Like, Joe Montana isn't a Chief. He is a 49er. He built that dynasty. And in that moment, he's thinking about Brady and thinking Tom's a Patriot and needs to finish his career here. Now, we know that ultimately isn't going to be what happens. That didn't happen. But I think it speaks to how Kraft thought about it and looked at the situation. And I think a lot of people in New England, for sure, and throughout the NFL, were shocked when Tom left. But, here's the thing. Tom is the ultimate outlier. 20 years playing at the top of the profession is unheard of for anybody. None of the quarterbacks you mentioned earlier were able to do that.
Right.
And Tom is still playing at an elite level. It's not like he's a backup or a kicker. Right. He is still an elite starting quarterback. And so I think it really comes down to when he decides he doesn't want to play anymore. But I think he felt as though he had done what he could do in New England, and he was still game for doing it and doing it somewhere else. And so, it remains to be seen whether a Super Bowl gets delivered to Tampa Bay. But I think you're right. I mean, historically, he will obviously always be looked at as a New England Patriot and probably go down in history as the greatest athlete in the history of Boston sports.
Yeah. Yeah, if not one of the greatest ever. I had this conversation with somebody, and they said, well, geez, what about the Celtics of the Bill Russell era? Well, they didn't have the salary cap. They didn't have, how many teams were in the league back then? 7. They didn't have cross-country travel. You can do the same thing with the Yankees or the Lakers dynasties. I mean, this dynasty and the salary cap in and of itself is meant to prevent dynasties like this. I guess you picked the best time ever to start reporting and researching this book, because you were maybe the only journalist that really witnessed Tom's transition to Tampa. Matter of fact, you were with Brady when he went to Robert Kraft's house, middle of the pandemic, and he tells him that he's leaving. Is that correct?
I wasn't with them during the pandemic. You're talking about the closing scene of the book.
The final part, yeah.
Yeah, that's the last scene of the book. And you're right, Brady does go to Kraft's house. It's a house I've been in many times. and I know where this scene went down and could describe it the way I did because I've been there so many times, but I wasn't physically in the room when that
Okay.
happened. But you're right. He did go to the house. There's an intimate conversation, socially distanced, two men who were already aware and sensitive to the seriousness of the pandemic, even though it was only March. And two guys who have a very a physically expressive way of basically telling each other that they love each other, which is something they do often. A kiss on the cheek and a hug is not unusual for Kraft and Brady. In this case, they couldn't do either one. I think that added an element of difficulty to this conversation. And then, you know, I don't want to do spoilers here on your in this interview, but
Please spoil us.
the fact is that it's not just Kraft that night. Brady wanted to also talk to Jonathan Kraft, Robert's son, who's the president of the team. They were more like brothers. I think Tom and Jonathan got along incredibly well. It's emotional when Tom calls Jonathan from Robert's house. Jonathan was actually out in Colorado skiing, and you know, it was emotional. And then after talking to him, then he called Bill from Robert's house. And I just thought that the symbolism of Tom Brady talking to Bill Belichick on a telephone from Robert Kraft's house was a great illustration of the fact that Robert Kraft has been the bridge between Tom and Bill for a long time. And this was the last time. And this last time, what I think was so unique and great about it was it wasn't acrimonious. It wasn't like the Beatles breakup.
Right.
It wasn't name calling and finger pointing and acrimony. It wasn't that at all. And I think, to me, there was a lot of respect expressed in that phone call. And also, quite honestly, I think both of them were relieved. You know, both Bill and Tom.
Belichick and Tom, yeah.
Yeah, I think Kraft was sad, understandably so. This is
an
like
emotional guy, you know. Bob
yeah,
Kraft.
and it's
Wears
like
that
your son leaving the family. I mean,
Right.
he should be sad.
Right.
And I think in the case of Tom and Bill, it was relief because these two guys have been under immense pressure. Immense pressure. I think to the degree that there's very few professional athletes and coaches that could relate to the kind of pressure they've been under for so long. I mean, it's the kind of pressure Michael Jordan was under. But Michael Jordan wasn't under it for 20 years. I mean, but he was under it.
And there was no social media back then. It makes a difference.
It makes a huge difference. And so in many ways, Tampa Bay is a great spot for Tom.
Now, I know you don't like to be a prognosticator, but do you think that he is successful ultimately here? And when do you think Tom hangs him up? I know that he has been very clear about how long he wants to play.
Yeah. And the thing that I learned working on this book is I looked at so many people over the last 20 years that either underestimated him or wrote him off prematurely. I am not going to fall into that trap door. I will just say that I think that only Tom can stop Tom. He's already proven that time isn't going to do it. It's going to be when he knows that it's time for him to walk away from the game, he will. As far as him being successful, in my mind, you know, he already is successful in Tampa Bay. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess depending on how you define success, but I think that, you know, Tampa Bay, the city is, and the fans will be ultimately pretty thrilled with the fact that they got the greatest quarterback ever to come and play for the franchise, no matter how long it is.
We love him. We love him down here. They really do. And I don't think it's like, you know, Manning going to Denver or something like that. The fans here are ready for this. They realize that he's 43, but they're still betting the farm on it. You had one story in the book where you talked about kind of that love between Belichick and Brady. I think it was at Gillette. The Patriots had just beat the Chiefs, and there was a moment in the tunnel. And I just wonder if you could tell us about that.
Yeah, I think the moment that you're referring to is actually pregame, if it's the one you're thinking of.
Yeah, it might have been like AFC Championship.
Yes,
game, like that.
So this was actually something that I observed. It was at Gillette Stadium, and it's at the end of the season, the regular season, where they're going to go and face the Rams and end up in the Super Bowl against the Rams. And that was a tough season, but a good season. And as they were coming off the field, I mean, one thing I noticed, because I was on the field pregame for every game that season at Gillette Stadium, and it was clear to me that they're always off in their own world during the pregame stuff. Bill is by himself, and
what are you doing? Are you just observing, kind of off on the
yes,
side? Okay.
yes, I'm on the sideline and I'm just watching, and I would do that every Sunday. I don't talk to people because I don't want to be in anybody's way. Everybody's doing their job, and I'm just trying to do mine. And what I noticed, it's amazing what you can pick up by just keeping your mouth shut and just sort of watching things. I had watched this week after week after week, and then I saw something different this Sunday, which was as they were coming off the field, they were coming from different places on the field, but they were heading towards the tunnel. And I think Brady spotted Belichick first. Belichick was walking with his head down, so he wouldn't have seen Tom coming. Tom saw him and went out of his way to walk over to him and sort of intersect with him, or get in his way.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't say anything to each other. But when Belichick saw Tom in his path and Tom reaching out to him with his hand, you could see how much Bill appreciated that. And then he put his arm around Tom and patted him on the behind or on the back. And just the expression that was between the two of them, to me, it was the perfect illustration of the fact that these two guys don't need to talk to each other to be better than everybody else. They do have their own unique language, and it's not oral. That's the thing about it, is they know each other's thinking, and there is an appreciation. Doesn't mean there's not stress in the relationship. Doesn't mean it's not hard. Doesn't mean there aren't moments where one of them would like to maybe deck the other one.
Right.
That's not the point. The point is that they are true professionals. They know each other, and they respect and appreciate each other. And then they went out that day and annihilated the other team. And that's what I was trying to get at. As they disappeared into the tunnel for pregame, Brady is the star, goes down first. All the fans are screaming and yelling. And then Bill goes down behind him, sort of in his shadow, with his head down. Unlike Tom, he doesn't look up at the fans. He is in his own world. And I think that's the sign of a genius. I think Bill's a genius coach. And that, I don't use that term lightly. I think he deserves to be called that. Right. Part of being a genius, most geniuses are very insular. They're lonely in a way because they occupy a space that no one else is in. And I think Bill's that kind of guy.
Jeff, I can't wait to finish up this book. Thank you so much for all your time this morning. We really appreciate it. We hope Tom Brady has some of that success down here in Tampa Bay. And who knows, Jeff, honestly, I was going to say this, but I'm definitely going to say it now. You might have to write another final chapter to this book, because the dynasty, at least for Tom, may continue down here for the next several years.
I wouldn't mind being able to do that.
Yeah. Jeff Benedict, thank you so much for your time. The book is Dynasty. We appreciate all your time, and hopefully we talk to you again.
Thank you, Rob. Appreciate it.
All right, Jeff, take care.